Title: Genesis 12:10-20, God's unchanging promise. Contents: 12:10-20. God's unchanging promise. Abram's life was based on God's covenant. It is different from the covenant of the law. This covenant is a covenant of grace. Therefore, it is called the gospel. Like Abram, we too have the covenant of God's grace. We are living a life of faith based on the promise of the gospel, which is clearer than the covenant of Abram. Let us examine the nature of the gospel given to us through the appearance of Abram's life. Our gospel is God's promise that cannot be broken. 1. Like Abram, we too live on the basis of the covenant of the gospel of God. What is Abram's covenant? Genesis 12:1-3. Then, what is our gospel covenant? Galatians 4:4-7, 2. Abram not faithful to the covenant, 10-16, in obedience to God's promises and commands, Abram began a life of faith toward the land God would show him. Finally, Abram was instructed by God and settled in Canaan. But when we arrived in the promised land, it was not a rosy paradise. It was not a land of blessing, but a land of famine. Abram left his belief in God's covenant for a while and exercised his brilliant human wisdom. He decided to take a brief refuge in Egypt. 10. What happened to Abram on his way to Egypt? It was anxieties, fears, and ominous thoughts. Verses 11 and 12. This anxiety and fear prompted Abram to devise a means of lying. 13. What did this result of human wisdom bring to him? Verses 14 and 15. At this time Abram had an opportunity to tell the truth. But he couldn't. Why? It was because they did not believe in God's covenant. Look at verse 16. Up until this point, I had a chance to speak. But it didn't. It was because they forgot God's covenant and depended on their own methods. 3. God is faithful to the covenant. 17-20. A covenant is made by both parties. Abram failed religiously with this covenant. Has this covenant been broken now? The answer is verse 17. This verse is the climax of the text. Definitely not. This covenant is a promise of grace that can never be cancelled despite Abram's religious failure. Although we may easily forget the gospel covenant, God never forgets or abrogates the gospel promise. The gospel of Jesus Christ can never be destroyed. If we do not live by faith, the people around us may suffer. And they are put to shame and rebuked by the world. 18-19. But the surprising fact is that God does not forsake us. 20. Dear saints, the gospel of God is absolutely certain. Therefore, it is to believe in the gospel to the end without being influenced by circumstances. Even in an environment of famine, if we hold on to the gospel, endure, wait and endure, God will surely work according to the gospel covenant. I hope you believe it.